Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for what will be undoubtedly a great discussion of the Sixth Plenum, which was held a few weeks ago. My name is Jude Blanchette, and I'm the Freeman Chair in China Studies here at CSIS, and I'm delighted to be joined by my colleagues, Bonnie Lin, who's the director of the China Power Project, and Scott Kennedy, who is the Trustee Chair, Chinese Business and Economics. 2 weeks later, after the sixth plenary session of the 19th Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, I think it's clear that this was really a momentous meeting. We expected that going in. There were rumors about a history resolution, but also just this period in time within which the sixth plenum was taking place. There was already speculation about the 20th Party Congress next year, and will or will not Xi Jinping take a third term as General Secretary. The meeting, of course, was taking place within the context of a deteriorating relationship with the United States, and also occurring in the midst of another topic that we've covered a lot here at CSIS, the summer storm of regulatory activities, the announcement of a new framework of common prosperity. And of course, on the foreign policy front, in addition to US-China relations, there has been a significant escalation activity in the Taiwan Strait. So this meeting was occurring amidst a backdrop of fairly significant events, both within and outside of China. And I have to say, the meeting did not disappoint for folks who were eagerly paying attention to this. The history resolution did indeed come about, and a lengthy document at that, one which will obviously continue to be poring over for weeks, months, and possibly years ahead to figure out its significance. And the meeting left us, I think, with some really important questions, both from the communique, the history resolution, and all of the narrative that surrounded the meeting, both leading into it and coming out of it. What does it tell us about Xi Jinping's hold on power? What does it tell us about his plans at the 20th Party Congress? What does this tell us about the future of economic policy? What does this tell us about foreign policy, including the very salient issue of Taiwan? Thankfully, we've assembled just an absolutely fantastic panel to help us think through these. My colleague Scott is doing double duty here today, both as a co-convener, but also as an expert panelist. And joining him is Chris Buckley, who is the chief China correspondent at the New York Times, dialing in from Australia. From the UK, we've got Patricia Thornton, who's an associate professor of Chinese politics at the University of Oxford and editor of China Quarterly. And closer to home, we're really delighted to welcome Phil Saunders, who's the director of the Center for the Study of Chinese Military Affairs at National Defense University. I'm going to turn it over in a minute to my colleague, Bonnie Lin, who is going to ask the first volley of questions. But let me just make a quick logistics note. In terms of format, Bonnie and I are going to be alternating asking questions to the panelists. We'll try to get through this in about 45 minutes and keep about 15 minutes for question and answer. You can, as everyone I'm sure 2 years into the pandemic is well aware, you can ask questions via Zoom in the Ask Question button, and we'll be collating and collecting those. And when it comes time for the Q&A, we'll be selecting from those to ask the audience, but you can pose those at any time throughout the event. You don't need to wait 40 or 45 minutes. And so with that, I think we're ready to get started. So thanks again to everyone for joining us. A huge thanks to the panelists, and let me turn it over to Bonnie Lin.
Thank you very much, Jude. So as Jude mentioned, we have a number of really great panelists. So first, our first panelist is Chris Buckley. So Chris, thank you again for joining us today. As Jude mentioned, you have immense experience covering and assessing developments within China. To kick off this discussion of the sixth plenum, can you provide us with an overview of the key topics covered at the plenum? what topics did you see were given the most weight? What did you find as the most significant outcomes? And of course, what developments or outcomes did you find surprising or unexpected? So Chris, over to you.
Thanks, Bonnie. Jude already offered a general overview of this big meeting this month. I just add a little bit of context to that. These Central Committee meetings of the Chinese Communist Party happen in normal years once a year, and they're an opportunity for the party elite, about 370 or so senior officials, to get together and to discuss and endorse the general direction of policy. Now, this particular Central Committee meeting was particularly important for one reason. It's happening 1 year before the next Party Congress, the 20th Party Congress, when Xi Jinping, by all signs, is likely to seek and probably gain another 5-year term in power. And this Central Committee Plenum did two things. First of all, it formally set in motion the preparations for the next Party Congress. And secondly, and most substantively, it issued a new resolution on Chinese Communist Party history, only the third in the party's 100 years of history. Now that was important. The content and the mode in which that summation of history was given is important. This year is the centenary of the Chinese Communist Party, 100 years since it was founded in 1921. Xi Jinping had plenty of opportunities throughout the year to give his official overview of the meaning of 100 years of Chinese history. He could have, in particular, have given that overview, that official summary, in July 1, the official day of the founding of the Communist Party. Instead, on the July 1 big events in Beijing, he essentially gave a very brief pep talk about the Communist Party and where it was. And he left the substance of summing up Chinese party history to this Central Committee meeting. And that matters because now what Xi Jinping has done has delivered his overview, his interpretation of the meaning of 100 years of Chinese Communist Party history, in particular the meaning of his 9 years in power, in the form of an official document, which is now almost holy scripture for party members, something that has to be studied, followed, and obeyed. And that matters in particular because if we look at the contents of the resolution on history, well, it gives an overview of the trajectory of the party's experience since its founding. A generally very positive overview, of course. First of all, the decades of revolution and socialist construction under Mao, the period of reform and opening up under Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, and Hu Jintao. And most signally and importantly, it gives over the bulk of its summation of the past 100 years of history to just the past 9 years, the so-called new era of power under Xi Jinping. So as an assessment of Chinese Communist Party history, it clearly puts Xi Jinping in the grand overview of Chinese history as almost a co-equal of Mao and Deng Xiaoping. And now the fact that he's doing this 12 months, likely 12 months before the next Party Congress then matters, because if you read the party resolution, as I said, most of it's about the past 9 years. And so and a lot of it actually reads not so much like a history resolution, but like a preparatory political work report for the next Party Congress late next year. Usually at a Party Congress, we know that the General Secretary, Xi Jinping, in this case, gives a work report on what he's been doing over the past 5 years. Now, what Xi Jinping has already done in this resolution is to give an overwhelmingly positive, a glowing overview of his achievements in the past, not just 5 years, but past 9 years. So that means even before the official party preparations for the Party Congress have begun, Xi Jinping has already given himself a glowing report card. And that matters in Chinese politics because insofar as there's going to be any pushback or any resistance to what Xi Jinping can achieve in the next Party Congress, that's going to be weakened now because he's already won from the broader party elite this very positive overview of his term in power.
Thank you, Chris. So relative to this glowing report card that President Xi Jinping presented at the 6th Plenum, what does this mean in terms of moving forward of how much Xi has consolidated control and power in China? And what does this mean for when you're looking at the 20-party Congress? And does this mean that he has a secured third term?
Well, it takes a certain amount of confidence and indeed high self-regard to write so much of yourself into a history resolution like that. So to that extent, I think we can say that Xi Jinping seems very confident about his hold on power. I think we're beyond now talking about Xi Jinping consolidating power. I think what we can see in terms of the Central Committee resolution on history and also the communique is an effort now to begin to consolidate and entrench that power longer term, but also entrench the agenda that lies behind Xi Jinping's era as well. He often talks about this new era of one of rising strength for China, rising national strength. And the high notes that he hits in the resolution really do emphasize that theme, that what China now needs to do is to strengthen the party at home, and also to strengthen and consolidate its influence abroad as well. So to that extent, I think we do certainly see a leader who is confident. At the same time, I think there's always this paradox in Chinese politics of confidence going with anxiety. And the fact that Xi Jinping feels it necessary to imprint himself in a resolution to such a deep extent does betray a certain, does reveal this constant anxiety about wanting to forestall any opposition or notes of dissent within the party elite. It is notable that the two previous resolutions in 1945 under Mao Zedong and then 1981 when Deng Xiaoping was coming back to power, both of those leaders left the drafting or the day-to-day drafting of the resolutions to subordinates. In this case, what we can see is Xi Jinping did seem to play a much more active role in drafting the resolution, and he appointed himself as head of the drafting team.
Thank you, Chris. So you mentioned Xi's new era. Could you go a little bit more in depth on what does the new era mean? And in particular, how do you place Xi's new era compared to some of the early eras? For example, the reform and opening era. How do you interpret these 9 years, or what's moving forward compared to before?
Well, we can see in the resolution and the other announcements from the Party Central Committee meeting that Xi Jinping wants to define his time in power starting from 2012 as a new watershed in Chinese political history, one that is preceded by the 30 years of reform and opening up inaugurated by Deng Xiaoping and his comrades, and then previous to that, the decades of revolution and socialist construction under Mao. So he's just talking about this new period as being a new era defined by new priorities, new imperatives and new challenges for the party as well. And what are those challenges and imperatives? Well, there's a whole range of them, but he sums them up as being about this new phase of China's rise, which is very much focused on strengthening China. So while Mao brought China to stand up against foreign and domestic oppression and exploitation, and the Deng Xiaoping era was about China becoming more prosperous, official party history now says that the new era is about strength. Now, what does that mean? I think that the resolution is actually very helpful in giving us a sense about what Xi Jinping's priorities are. First of all, if you do look at all of the areas of policy that are listed and evaluated in the resolution, in many of them, when it comes out to identifying the achievements under Xi Jinping, the focus is very much on this process of strengthening the state, of making the state more effective, and strengthening and reviving party power as well. So in other words, there's not much space given, very little in fact, to, for example, liberalization or freeing up parts of the economy. It's very much about strengthening the party state. The other interesting aspect of this, I think, Bonnie, is if you look at when it comes to the resolution's explanation about why China needed to enter this new era of power under Xi Jinping, this new era focused on national strength, it doesn't offer a very powerful case in some ways, but one thing it does identify is that it does say, I think very interesting, that when China was entering this period of a new era, it emphasizes that China had to respond to a number of challenges. And I do find it very interesting that the first challenge that identifies is rising external risks and pressures. So I think we can see there that part of what Xi Jinping is defining or trying to define the new era as being is one about where China's not necessarily confronting the rest of the world, but is being much more active about defending its interests and responding to challenges from abroad. So I think that begins to give us a much clearer sense about what Xi Jinping's priorities will be after the next Party Congress.
Thank you very much, Chris. A lot of food for discussion, and I'm sure many questions will be directed at some of the comments that you made and insights. Let me now turn it to Jude, my colleague Jude, to moderate the next two panelists.
Great, thanks, Bonnie. I'm gonna now turn to Tia to ask if, and I think Chris dug into some of this, but I want to know if you could help us excavate a little bit more deeply on the resolution themselves. The first question is, you've of course been looking at the 1945 history resolution, the 1981 resolution. Obviously, these history resolutions are all different and designed to solve different equations for these three leaders. And so I wanted to ask you, looking across the sweep of now three resolutions, what stuck out to you about this current one? What was different from it? And to that basic question of kind of what was the equation that she was looking to solve here in contradistinction to Mao in 45 and Deng in 1981? What is your assessment of that? You're on mute.
All right, you got me now.
Yep.
So yeah, and I actually agree with just about everything Chris has already said about the nature of the resolution. In some ways, so starting with what's similar. So what is similar about all three of the resolutions is that all history resolutions are designed by strong leaders who are attempting to put an end.
Hey Tia, actually, I'm just gonna. Could you get a little bit closer to the mic? It's hard to hear. It sounds like there's a little bit of background noise or a fan or a leaf blower or something.
I don't have anything like
that's better.
On.
Yeah, that's better.
Okay.
Just
right.
Thanks.
Yeah. So yeah. So at any rate, in all of the cases, all three cases, you have a strong leader who's attempting to put to bed previous disputes. So 1945, Mao was facing some very real rivals within the Chinese Communist Party, who were actually in the 1940s. And the goal of the 1945 resolution was to define what was the correct line moving forward. And Mao's correct line, because he was facing off with favorites from the Comintern, he wanted to take forward the idea that China needs to sinicize Marxism Leninism. So in that respect, it's the 1945 resolution was about 27,000 words long, and one would expect that there would be many mentions of Mao, because he's comparing himself and his line to the other his rivals, and in fact there were about just over 40 mentions of Mao's name. 36 years later, in the second resolution, 1981, you had 104 mentions of Mao's name, so considerably more discussion of Mao by Deng Xiaoping, and only 10 mentions of Deng Xiaoping. So there wasn't really a lot of discussion, but what's really remarkable about this particular resolution, the second resolution was 34,000 words. This one is about 37,000 words. And what is really interesting about it is you have about 11 mentions of Mao, 3 of Deng Xiaoping, 1 each of Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, the 14 of Xi Jinping. So we do seem to have more of a focus on Xi Jinping. And also, I mean, if we even go just beyond the sheer word count, we basically see that roughly a quarter of this resolution it focuses on the first 91 years of the PRC, and 75% of the text seems to be more future, either present or directed. So that makes it really very, very different. So it does, it's very different in terms of the other two historical resolutions, about which the future plays a very minor role. So this almost actually reads in a way as a campaign speech for Xi Jinping as leader for life.
That probably sets up or partially answers the next question I was going to ask you, but I think partly because when we think that there's a big history resolution that in the title is covering 100 years of the party, I think many were expecting, some thought maybe this was going to be a moment for a significant reassessment of some previous historical events. I heard chatter that this could be one way or the other. Either this was going to be a whitewashing completely of the Great Leap Forward of the Cultural Revolution, or the other way that we were going to see some more pronounced reconciliation with the past. I know from the neo-Maoists that I followed, they were certainly hoping it was going to be a move away from the 81 resolutions line on the Mao period. And yet, in point of fact, when the final document came out, and it seemed to be saying, look, we've already discussed history in the 81, so let's move on. But can I just ask you, with more of a political scientist and historian's eye, what did you find anything notable either in the brevity or in the way that it approached some of the previous negative historical periods that was interesting or striking to you?
I was surprised really that any of the previous history was mentioned at all, although there wasn't much, as I've already said, there wasn't all that much attention or in terms of textual weight that was given to the Mao era. The one notable change from between this resolution's assessment of the Mao era and the 1981 resolution assessment is that the third resolution seems to date Mao's errors to 1956, which is somewhat earlier than in the third resolution. And let me just say, with respect to that, picking up on something that Chris has just said, which is these resolutions, we're assuming that this shows that Xi Jinping is incredibly strong. But in fact, there's some evidence to suggest that he's feeling somewhat insecure because, well, for one thing, we have this discussion on the front page of People's Daily after the resolution was passed. That was an account of how the Central Committee met and discussed the resolution. And I don't know if anyone else picked up on this. It would be interesting to hear what others thought. But one of the things that I noticed was this discussion of how the Central Committee members were broken into 10 groups. And of course, the way it was presented, it said everyone was very enthusiastic and the room was humming. People were so intrigued by this document. But in fact, what the reporter also said was that they had set up microphones and that everyone jumped to their feet and they were rushing to these microphones. And to the point that the reporter stated that people were speaking before the previous speaker had stopped speaking. And so that was, I think, a little sideways hint that there was some discussion and perhaps some unhappiness about the content of the resolution. And in the same article, they said that the particular quote that was drawing the most attention from the Central Committee participants in the discussion had to do with the relationship between this particular resolution and the previous two, and what that was in fact about. So why was Xi Jinping? It sounds to me as though, and of course I'm speculating, but it sounds to me as though people were really trying to feel out, what it was that Xi Jinping was trying to establish with this resolution. Was he, in fact, in some way overturning the earlier assessments of Mao, or was Xi Jinping happy to accept this assessment, the 1981 resolution's assessment of the Mao era and its terrible mistakes, and then move forward. So there does seem to be some evidence that there's disagreement within the ranks of the Central Committee members who participated in the discussion as to what Xi's position in that history ought to be.
Thanks. That's really interesting, and hopefully in Q&A we can come back around to this. Let me now shift over to Scott. Scott, I was going to ask you some questions about economic policy, but can I actually first, just to stay on the historical reinterpretation line here, I know you had been thinking about what the document said in terms of how Xi was assessing the Deng period, and of course that has important implications for how we think about economic policy going forward. But can I just ask you on this historiography question, what did you note of interest about how the Deng and Reform and Opening period were discussed in the document?
Sure. Well, thanks, Jude. And it's good to be able to have this event together with you and Bonnie, and to have Chris, Tia, and Phil with us as well. And look forward to the conversation with the audience. There was some expectation going in that perhaps this resolution was going to attack the Deng era for its approach to promoting rapid growth over everything else. Instead, what we got is saying that there's certain policies that are appropriate for certain times, and times have changed. But it wasn't negative. But it was a rewriting of the Deng era, of the period from the mid 70s to the early noughts. And I think historians who care about accuracy in trying to describe what happened during that 35 plus years would note a few things that are not covered in the resolution or framed quite differently. There's of course no mention of two top party leaders that were party secretary, at least at some point in the 1980s, Zhao Ziyang and Hu Yaobang. The policy making process and the policies that followed one after the other, it was a lot messier than this resolution describes. Remember the phrase "feeling the stones to cross the river"? That's far more accurate than how this resolution comes across. There were a lot more unexpected twists and turns over those 35 years. Policy was much more decentralized. There was a lot more bottom-up exploration, and then the center approving some of those ideas, rejecting others. Remember the idea of playing to the provinces. There was a lot of foreign ideas brought not just by the World Bank and IMF, but by foreign governments, scholars, business people. There's a lot of lobbying by Chinese and foreign companies that affected the trajectory of economic policy. So a lot messier. There's also an economy in transition. What river were they trying to cross? They were trying to go from plan to market. Never got fully across, ended up with a hybrid economy. But there was clearly that trajectory. And finally, globalization. China was focused on learning from the world. The phrase "getting on the international track" was really central to the Deng era, adapting to global institutions and norms. The reason those four elements are all understated or ignored is because Xi Jinping and the current leadership is trying to say that the current trajectory of economic policy is a natural extension of what happened before, with appropriate shifts from the past. And in fact, I think the differences are much larger, but they can't say that without really undermining what they're trying to do now. And so I think that rewriting of the history is I think, unfortunate, because it also suggests some of the difficult choices that they've made, and things which we'll get to your next question, where they're going with economic policy now, which I think is going to generate more problems.
Yeah, building on that, Scott, there was a pretty striking section in the resolution where Xi Jinping was setting up some of the pathologies that had emerged from the focus on high growth in throughout the Reform and Opening period, and he has this line in there, something to the effect of, GDP can't be the only yardstick for development success. Can you build on that? And also in light of events since this summer, especially the Common Prosperity framework or emerging framework, it seems to be, or one could make a case that really the pledge at the 19th Party Congress of, we're shifting from aggregate growth to a focus on the quality of growth, which will portend a lower growth environment. What do you take away from the history resolution and also just events over the past 3 or 4 months to indicate in terms of how much of a tolerance or does Xi Jinping have for low growth? How low are they going to be comfortable moving here if it's growth that they're willing to sacrifice to address some of these structural problems? I think folks are now just trying to get a sense of where the trough is.
Sure.
So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. Thanks, Jude. I think it's although the current leadership is putting a lot of emphasis on this transition from rapid growth to high quality development, not just lower growth, but high quality development. I think actually that's been something that the multiple leaderships going back a few decades have recognized that it's a problem, particularly under Hu Jintao. We already have seen an emphasis on that. You can go back to political communique after political communique, government work report to government work report, where they emphasized unbalanced growth, the need to expand the social safety net, and things like that. But I think what he's doing is foot stomping that and trying to also anticipate that growth is slowing down and it's never going to pick up again. Growth reached its high point at in China at 14.5% in 2007, and it's dropped almost every single year since. Is 5.6%, 5.95% in 2019. Last year, of course, slow. This year will look better over 2020, but nevertheless, we're never going back to high growth. And I think the leadership is trying to basically reset expectations, even if actually it's some of the policies that they're going to be adapting aren't going to be such a dramatic shift in terms of that. So China still needs to create about 11 million new jobs every year to deal with folks who are graduating from high schools or colleges and need work, or those who lose jobs from companies that go under or are not successful. So it's still going to have to generate some growth. It's just going to have to be not just dependent on more government spending, more investment, but on other sources. Improving productivity is clearly a central part of the equation. And there's really three sources of that. The first is human capital, investing in education in cities and in the countryside. Second is making the financial system work a lot more so that there are less bridges to nowhere, apartment complexes that are unfilled for decades at a time. And finally, for advanced technology that are going to try and fuel so not only that you make shiny things, but shiny things that matter. That where China can be world leaders and where they are in control of that technology, not just at the manufacturing level, but in terms of inventions as well as branding at the front and the back. Those are all reasonable, important goals. But I think although those are important aims, and we might have seen those from any type of leadership, it's the approach, and go back to what Chris and Tia were mentioning, the role of the party state and Xi's defense of the party state playing a central, if not the only leadership role in society is what is so dramatically different. It's wrong to say that Xi Jinping dominates everything and that China is a large place with a lot of people. Local governments have a lot of sway. Individuals in different parts of life have sway, but this is a much more authoritarian top-down system under him. And the distance between business and society on the one hand and the party state on the other is a lot more narrow. And I think that is going to end up having a damaging effect to both growth and the other types of developmental goals that they have, including reducing the gap between rich and poor. And the top goal of the resolution, which was about increasing happiness, China still ranks 85th in the world in global in happiness. So they just have a long ways to go. And so it's a big agenda that they're trying to engineer. Some positive changes, but also some big problems that mean they're not probably going to get everything that they're aiming for.
Just a quick question, Scott, before I turn this back over to Bonnie, which is implications for US-China relations. I mean, of course, as is usually the case in these big party meetings, the US doesn't come up. But nonetheless, the subtext, as Chris mentioned earlier, or the explicit context of the international environment does come up. And of course, this the history resolution came out the day after, or a day or two after the Biden-Xi meeting. So I wanted to get your sense on looking at the guts of this, which was talking about economic policy and didn't seem to indicate any shift away from Xi's preferred approach here to using the party and state to, as Barry Naughton says, steer the economy. What implications do you think this has for some of the irritants in the bilateral relationship on the economic and trade side?
Sure. Very quickly, so we get back to everybody else. Positives and negatives. So on the positive side, actually, China's problems. This is going to mean less successful economic progress for China, less innovation if there's more constraints on private economy, saying that the internet firms aren't real high-tech firms. Well, how has China gotten through the pandemic? Luckily, they've had Alibaba, Tencent, and all those other companies. And there are huge sources of innovation, even on the manufacturing side. So I think we're going to see a less innovative China. So those are worried about China being 10 feet tall and eating our lunch. It's going to have more problems. On the other hand, they're not the dinosaurs of the Soviets in the 70s and 80s. This is going to be a muddling through economy, most likely. That's probably the base case scenario. So that's reasonable for the US to be able to deal with. China's got a growth, but serious problems. Tensions, though, as well. We're going to see greater protectionism from China. We are going to see a further blurring between the economy and national security and domestic security. That means more restrictions from the Chinese, means more restrictions from us. So folks that say decoupling is not possible, well, look, you should reassess that. I'm not saying absolutely, but more restrictions on both sides. More competition between these two kinds of economies, the US and China, for third markets, and greater competition between the US and China over the international rules of the game. The Chinese are focused like a laser on the WTO, regional organizations, standard-setting bodies, others. This is going to be a serious game. The US has got to up its game to compete along all these ways. So in some ways, less of an economic behemoth, but more tensions in the diplomatic space.
Great, excellent insights, Scott. Bonnie, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jude. So a second ago, earlier during this discussion, we covered the implications of the plenum for China domestically, politically, and also some of the implications for China economically, as well as broader US-China economic and trade relations. Now we want to pivot to understand what does the plenum and development since the plenum, what does that mean for China in terms of its foreign policy, in terms of its security and military developments. So here, we're incredibly grateful that Phil is here with us to describe all aspects of Chinese foreign policy, as well as discuss any developments that we might be seeing in terms of what's happening on the security side and with respect to the PLA. So Phil, the first question I want to ask you is, what do you see as some of the major changes on the foreign policy side? Specifically, when I read this resolution and the communique from the plenum, I saw that there was stronger language to suggest that the timing and the larger trend will always be on China's side when it comes to unification with Taiwan. I didn't personally see this as too much of a change from before, but some have noted that the stronger language. Do you see, first of all, did you see anything major on the foreign policy side from the plenum? And did you see this development on the Taiwan side as a change?
Yeah, when I think about Taiwan, I think for China, there's a gotta do, which is you gotta declare independence, and there's a wanna do, which is achieving unification. And I think what you get out of the plenum communique and the history document is a strong sense of confidence that momentum's on China's side. It has the initiative. It can dictate terms. And in some ways that doesn't seem entirely wrong, but it's not entirely right either. So there have been some gains. China's more powerful relative to Taiwan, relative to the US. That includes on the military side, where they've made up a lot of ground in conventional military power, especially if you're fighting close to China. I think their ability to deter Taiwan independence hasn't been in doubt for quite a while. And they've shown the ability to apply military pressure, to apply economic pressure to Taiwan, to steal their diplomatic allies, and to limit their international space. So there's a lot of coercive tools here that have improved China's position. But it seems overly confident, because what ought to be worrying China, what I think is worrying them, is the sentiment in Taiwan, where there's an increasing sense of a separate Taiwan identity. There's decreasing interest in unification. There's no market at all for the one country, two systems model, especially after what's happened in Hong Kong. And there's the possibility going forward that a deeper green or more pro-independence DPP candidate will win the presidency in 2024. None of those are good trends for the mainland and for unification. And they're also worried about what they see as an erosion of US support for the one China policy and kind of a set of salami tactics toward a more official relationship with Taiwan. And the question, what impact does that have on Taiwan, and does this constitute creeping independence? So there's a disjuncture between what you hear when you talk to Chinese analysts and the tone of this resolution, which is very confident. Now, part of that may be to diffuse pressure. The tone of this is, we got it, don't worry too much, we don't need to change course. And there's nothing in here that really changes course on Taiwan policy. But what I worry about a little bit is this concern about creeping independence, and less confident in the chances of peaceful unification if trends continue as they're going. And specifically, I worry whether China will feel that this move toward creeping independence really is a form of unification. Maybe they don't have that so well. Maybe they need to take some kind of military action to restore red lines, restore deterrence, and teach the pro-independence groups in Taiwan a lesson, and remind the US of what one China really means. So that's what worries me here. But I see this disjuncture between confidence in the documents and a reality where they're much more worried.
Phil, a quick follow-up question on this. So this weekend we saw that China sent 27 aircraft in Taiwan's status. How do you interpret this? Does this represent a continuity of China's Taiwan policy, or is this a shift after the 6th plenum?
I think it's a continuity with their policy since 2016, when President Tsai in Taiwan refused to endorse the 1992 consensus, although she made some conciliatory gestures. China basically decided they weren't going to deal with her. And so the approach shifted from engaging Taiwan, which had been the policy when Ma Ying-jeou was running things, to pressuring Taiwan and deterring independence. And we started to see more military pressure applied. This is kind of a continuation of that. It's a little bit different because you have a PLA that has a lot more capabilities. And so the Navy wants to be doing things to pressure Taiwan. The Air Force wants to be doing things to pressure Taiwan. And I think this is kind of a continuation of that. So there's some internal causes, but it's within the context of a broader policy where they decided to apply more pressure.
Great, thank you. So I want to cover on other topics aside from Taiwan. I just mentioned Taiwan just because it's always in the news, and it seems to be a topic that folks always mention with respect to Xi Jinping and his foreign policy these days. But another aspect of the resolution that we saw was mentioning that China had advanced major country diplomacy with Chinese characteristics. So what does this refer to, and what do you see in terms of the larger directions of Chinese foreign diplomacy and foreign policy? In other words, did the 6th plenum really set something forward?
Sure, this is talking about that concept of a community of common destiny or community of a shared future. And it's basically trying to emphasize an optimistic, cooperative approach to relations. And let's forget all about that stuff of power and military threats and conflicts of interest. Let's emphasize the positive, and we'll all get along. And if we're in a community of common destiny, we then none of that stuff matters. So it really downplays power imbalances. But really, it's sort of like that concept of a new model of great power relations with the United States. And my line at the time was, it's not a bad slogan so long as you don't take it seriously. And I feel that way about the community of common destiny. It is really hiding the fact that Chinese leaders think power matters a lot. And who is the more powerful position and who is in the less powerful position, they're all about that. And you see them increasingly using their power in various ways to try to shape the region and get what they want. So this is more sloganing than any kind of reality. But you have countries that are willing to mouth the words. I'm sure they don't really believe it and aren't really fooled by this. So it's kind of a self-congratulatory approach. Look how well our concept is going over. Again, this is sort of Xi grading his own performance and giving himself an A++ for it. I don't think I would agree that China's appeal has really increased so tremendously. There's lots of pushback to this more authoritarian China and to a China that's more aggressive in throwing its weight around. So-called wolf warrior diplomacy is counterproductive. They talked about trying to defuse the Quad by playing of differences of interest, and then they go out and antagonize the United States, India, Australia, and Japan simultaneously, and they drive them together. So by any objective means, that's not a policy that's working really well. But if you read the resolution, it's all going great. So I think it's a little self-congratulatory and missing some of the ways where some of their policies have been counterproductive in recent years.
Bill, you mentioned that China is very attentive to power dynamics and the realities of power. So looking forward, we had discussed that one of the things that the Plenum did set Xi up for is for greater control, potentially a third term. What would that mean in terms of foreign policy? So if Xi was to have a third term, would you be concerned that a more confident Xi that has a much tighter control on China would be more assertive in China's neighborhood? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think you'll see a continuation of trend because I think this assertiveness started happening around 2008, 2009, before Xi was in power. It intensified in 2012 and 2013 when he was in fuller control. So you'll see more of that going forward. But I think you also have to, and I think the clear lesson here is, look out for a third term and maybe a fourth term beyond that. And for a Xi that's unquestionably in power, and vis-a-vis the military, probably also more clearly in power, because he's personally involved in promoting all of those senior leaders, and they owe their careers and their positions to him. So I think that's a source of considerable influence. That said, it's a more powerful China, it's a more assertive China. There still are limits here. They're still trying to operate in the gray zone. They're trying to avoid the use of lethal force. They're trying to avoid actions that would destabilize the region. I mean, one of the slogans of the communique is pursuing progress while ensuring stability. And that sounds a lot to me like the old slogan of balancing rights protection, sovereignty protection, and maintaining stability. That's still, I think, the basic dynamic, but just the balance has twisted toward a more assertive posture. Still a balancing act, but Xi Jinping pushing the envelope a little bit. And I think you'd see more of that in the future if he's here for a third term.
And one final question to you, Phil, and then back to Jude for the Q&A. So the final question I have for you is related to the implications of the Sixth Plenum for the PLA. So in the past weekend, we saw that Xi convened a major meeting of the Central Military Commission with a focus on military talent cultivation. What does this mean? Does this mean the PLA is going in a new direction, or could you discuss a bit about what you think is the importance of this meeting?
Sure. Well, one of the critical issues when we think about the PLA, we think about the weapons it has, we think about its organization and its doctrine, but the other key element is the people in the PLA, and particularly the senior officer corps, but also the troops. They want to fight a war, a kind of a style of warfare that's informationized war, maybe intelligentized war, that really puts a premium on a talented military. But they don't have senior leaders who've ever fought jointly, they don't have combat experience, they don't have joint experience, and trying to fight a major war in a joint fashion is a real challenge. So what I think you see is this is the third phase of the PLA reforms. They fixed the organization. Now they're going after how do you build the type of soldiers and the type of combat leaders, the type of joint leaders that you really need to make use of all this hardware. And this is a serious and very difficult thing. For the US military, this was a generational challenge. It took 20 years past Goldwater Nichols to really get there in terms of a joint military. So I think that's what this most recent conference is about, saying that the personnel side is going to be key to success. And for Xi Jinping, first and foremost is political reliability. You've got to be there for the party, you've got to believe in the party, you've got to support the party, and we'd like you also to be a competent military leader as well. I'm trying to get both of those things going.
Great, thank you, Phil. Jude, back to you for the Q&A.
Great, thanks, Bonnie. We've got about 10 minutes left, and we've got some good questions going in. Just for the sake of time, I'm going to bundle a few of these together. And the first question I'm going to pose to Chris and Tia. So maybe Chris, have your thoughts first, and then get Tia's reaction. So the combined questions are about the odors of the cult or personality cult, which we're wafting fairly strongly from the plenum, as well as the history resolution. What is the level of tolerance for movement in this direction in the system? Obviously, one of the points of the 81 resolution and subsequent amendments to the PRC Constitution in 82 was about signaling clearly we're not going back in this direction of one-man rule, personality cults are behind us, and yet some of the official propaganda coming out now almost hints that Xi Jinping shoots an 18 on an 18-hole golf course. Chris and Tia, can I ask you in succession, how far is this going to go, and what do we suspect are the outer bounds of tolerance for this? Or are there any now that Xi Jinping appears to have achieved some sort of escape velocity from effective opposition? Chris, over to you first.
Yes, it's a very good question, and I would think that to judge from the official response to the plenum and the history resolution so far, we haven't yet reached the outer extremes of any tolerance of this extremely active promotion of Xi Jinping as a singularly important leader. Since the resolution was released and also the plenum communique, we've had this outburst of statements from leaders across China, provincial and local leaders as well, all of them following this script of studying and embracing the key messages of the plenum communique and the resolution. And it is striking that in speech after speech after speech, officials say that the core message from the Central Committee documents is the so-called two establishments, the Liang establishing Xi Jinping as the core leader of the Chinese Communist Party and the broader Chinese nation, and also establishing Xi Jinping thought as the guiding doctrine of the party as well. And so what we've seen is leaders coming forward, embracing this message, endorsing it. And of course, there's almost this dynamic of a competition for officials to demonstrate their loyalty, to demonstrate their fealty to the party, by going ever further in pressing that message. One of the most striking statements of it came from Li Hongzhong, the party secretary of Tianjin, a few days ago in the People's Daily, a very zealous supporter of Xi Jinping in previous campaigns as well. I don't have the statement in front of me, but he does state in a particularly vivid words the general message coming out of the plenum, which is that Xi Jinping's core status is vital, he says, to the rise and fall of the party and to the fate of the country and the party as well. So with that kind of messaging, I don't think we're at the final stage of this promotion of Xi Jinping as a singly important leader. And some of the official comments are putting a more sophisticated gloss on it as well. arguing that China is now entering this period of greater uncertainty, of external risk, but also domestic challenges as well. And it's precisely in these circumstances that China needs to hold to a strong centralized leadership. And of course, that message is also embedded in the resolution as well. Now that said, as you say, Xi Jinping may be very powerful, but he is neither omnipotent nor immortal. So there's certain points in the resolution which I would say don't necessarily point to weaknesses right now, but point to certain vulnerabilities or areas of policy where Xi Jinping may feel a bit weaker. I was struck, for example, that given the singular importance of COVID and last year in Xi Jinping's time in power and redefining China's role in the world, it doesn't really get too much space in the resolution. Also notable is the absence of any discussion of the changes in family planning policy as well. So there's certain areas of policy where you think, well, maybe these are areas where Xi Jinping and his confederates in the leadership feel a bit more vulnerable or feel that they haven't arrived at a unified view on what to make of those policies. All of that said, I think, although there's certain to be criticism, misgivings about the extent to which the resolution promotes Xi Jinping, even above other leaders like Mao and Deng, I still don't see China at a point now where that kind of grumbling or disquiet in China, and perhaps even within the party itself, is coalescing into any form of opposition or any kind of force that could challenge Xi Jinping. So I think as things stand now, I think it still seems very likely that Xi Jinping will claim that for the next 5-year term in power.
Great, thanks, Chris. Tia, we just have just a few minutes left. I wanted to get your thoughts on that, either building on any of Chris's comments just now or your own take. And I'd love to hear your final thoughts on kind of the year ahead and looking to the 20th Party Congress.
Yeah, so the second of the resolutions that were made out of the 6th plenum was to open up the appointing of representatives for the next party Congress. And I found that significant, although perhaps not as significant, getting back to what Chris said, as the fact that in Tianjin, which I'm sure most of you already saw, that the Wai Ban also opened a study session to study the thought of Peng Liyuan. So we're talking about nauseating displays of loyalty, to use Victor Xi's term. I think that this shows that and this is coming just on the heels of the history resolution. So to me, it looks as though the Xi Jinping cult of personality is in fact or continuing to build. And I do think, again, as I said before, that there is some concern about this within the party, because that front page article on the Renmin Ribao that I mentioned, talking about the how the Central Committee was dealing with the text of the resolution, the author said that the comrades attending the meeting were particularly concerned on how to properly handle the relationship between the new historical resolution and the previous 2 historical resolutions, particularly in view of the fact that Xi, in his opening speech, had declared that the major issues of right and wrong in the party's history had been basically resolved by the earlier 2 resolutions. So of course, as Jude is just saying, in the second resolution, the big conclusion was that the reason for the party's grievous errors was Mao's cult of personality. And I think that's precisely what was in the minds of the people that were reading this new resolution. That is, if she's going to come out and say very openly that we're taking these 2 resolutions as statements of fact, and yet he's clearly moving on and abandoning norms of succession, of collective leadership, of inter-party democracy, then I think that there has been some serious discussion within the party about what the implications of this is going to be moving forward to the 20th Party Congress.
Excellent. It just made me think that maybe there's a new principal contradiction coming into being between party settled doctrine and historiography on the cult of personality and Xi Jinping's evolving posture towards governance. I feel like we could do another hour of this, but to be respectful of everyone's time, it literally just turned 4 o'clock on my clock here. And so I want to just, first of all, really thank our panelists today who have just given, I think, immense insight and into a wide spread of topics here, all coming out of this meeting. So want to thank Phil, want to thank Tia, want to thank Chris, and want to thank Scott for double duty as both co-convener and panelist. Thanks to Bonnie Lynn, and thanks to everyone at the team at CSIS who make these events possible. I hope we're going to stay in contact with Phil, Tia, and Chris. We could probably already plan our 20th Party Congress event or events now. So please, audience, expect to have this same superstar panel 12 months or so from now as we try to unpack what just happened at the 20th Party Congress. But for now, thanks to Chris for getting up so early. Thanks to Tia for staying up so late. And everyone here in the East Coast, have a wonderful rest of your afternoon and see you at a future CSIS event.